Good Friday morning. Welcome to Beginning the Word. Today we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. Yes, and if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. Paul begins with this word, yes. This is an affirmative or an interjection, sort of, we might say, that goes back to what he said previously, where he talked about the day of Christ. The day of Christ and his desire for them to participate in it and for him to rejoice in their salvation on that final day. He longs for them to participate in the resurrection of the dead at the last day and to be with Jesus in that. And this yes is a reaffirmation, where he's doubling down on that desire for them to participate in this day and to be raised with Christ. And this is almost, with this yes, a chance for him to say, and if that wasn't clear enough, if you didn't believe me on that, let me speak on it again. I'm gonna really tell you how serious I am about you participating in the resurrection. He says, yes, if I'm being poured out, specifically poured out as a drink offering. We'll talk about what that means in a second. A drink offering on the sacrifice and service of your faith. All right, so this pouring out, as we mentioned, refers to a drink offering that's been supplied for us to see here. And it's a practice that we may not be very familiar with as we think about the sacrifices and offerings in the Old Testament. Specifically, what would happen with the drink offering is you take the wine and you pour it out in service to God. And that's kind of strange to us as we think about the animal sacrifices. We can sort of see the substitutionary element in the fact that some of those sacrifices, the food was eaten by the priest, and then you've got grain offerings, and you take that, and that's given to the priest for them to consume. And we kind of understand the logic of these things, how they get used, and what they're accomplishing. But the drink offering is a little harder. It's not something we really have a frame of reference for, because the notion is that you take it and you pour it out. And it doesn't seem like it's really playing much of a purpose or what it's doing. And in some sense, it feels like it's getting wasted. We might say that in air quotes, and there's a sense in which that's right. The logic of this is really twofold in this expending this liquid. The first is about God and him being worthy, and the second is about God and him providing. So God's worthiness and God's provision are at the core of this. In terms of God's worthiness, this is God's greatness is such that there doesn't need to be utility in honoring him. God is so worthy of praise and adoration that there doesn't have to be some quid pro quo or some effect that I'm bringing about by the cause of this action. With the various animal sacrifices, maybe I get forgiveness of sins. With the various offerings that we talked about, of the priests eating them, it supplies the service of the tabernacle and temple complex more generally. But humans getting no utility out of it, what does that show? It shows that God is just worthy of it, that he is worthy of praise, that he is worthy of honor. And me as a human getting some service out of that thing, or getting some benefit out of thing, is not necessary. That God is worthy in and of himself. That this is a testament to his greatness. That just giving something and that thing, its only use being a declaration of the transcendence and worthiness of God, that is a sufficient use in and of itself. There doesn't have to be some specific benefit other than testifying to God's glory. The second idea is in God providing. As we mentioned there, it's not really wasted in the sense that it's testifying to God's worthiness and to God's glory, but there is some fact in which we don't get to use that thing anymore. It's a complete surrender of it, and we see this, that God provides in that. Implicit in this is the idea that if I pour this out, I trust that God can provide again if I really need it. That ultimately all things belong to him, that this wine, this drink offering that I'm going to pour out, it doesn't really belong to me, it belongs to God for his purposes. And if I take this thing and I give it to God, I just expend it, I waste it from a human perspective, and God says, hey, you really needed that thing, you didn't need to give that up, you really needed it, then God has it within his power and his prerogative to restore that to me or to not restore it to me. In this case, Paul is noting that his service and his sacrifice and his service are like that. They are a testament to the worthiness of God, and they're also a testament of God's ability to provide for them. In the first, that God is worthy of it, even if he doesn't get any benefit, even if this doesn't turn out as he would like for it to, even if they don't rejoice with him and participate in the day of Christ. It was worthy for God to be honored by Paul's sacrifice, even if he gets nothing out of it. And similarly, he trusts that it's God who is truly providing the growth and that God is at work in them to do these things, that God's the one who's going to provide all of that, that's what's really needed. And this drink offering, this being poured out, this being expended, this being used up and totally drained is a beautiful picture of Paul's intensity, of Paul's care for them and for his desire to honor God in that. And this idea of a drink offering, of wine being poured out is somewhat graphic and evocative. If you think about it, as you come to that temple or tabernacle, to that altar area, and you pour the wine out, as you look there and you kind of like take a step back and just survey the ground there, you've got this pool of red liquid that's just laying there of seemingly no purpose or utility. And as I mentioned, at the risk of being too graphic, when Paul was beheaded, you've got a similar situation, whereas he puts his head on the block and he has his head removed from him. There's a lot of blood that comes in that. And as his body's removed, you look and there's just this pool of red liquid on the ground that seems to be of no sense or purpose at all. And you can sort of see these images merging onto each other, of them sort of being the same. That this is sort of a foreshadowing of his ultimate death. That's ultimately not just in his day-to-day sacrifice and service, but him being expended at his final life and the removal of his life from him. And he's going to be willing to go through that and to completely expend himself. Why? So that the Philippians may come to know Christ more deeply. And so Paul says, I'm going to do that, but what am I going to do also? I'm going to be glad and I'm going to rejoice with you all. That as Paul goes through this, the thought of him leaving it on the line, having nothing in the tank and being completely used up to be sure that his fellow Christians can be connected to Christ as is possible in his life, that was a source of joy for him. It was a source of gladness. When he thought about the service and the difficulty that he'd go through for these people to know Christ and to participate in the day of Christ, it made him smile. Even the extreme pain and the extreme loss that he endured, it wasn't a drudgery. It wasn't him dragging his feet. It wasn't some necessary evil. But he loved even the difficulties. And towards them, he had a heart of gladness from the good that came from it. And so he calls for that for this same reason. Because Paul's giving all this up, he wants him to be glad and to rejoice with me. Paul asks similarly for them to rejoice and be glad with him. Obviously, Paul's primary desire is to honor Christ, but he wants to share in joy with them. He wants them to look at him and to have the genuine relationship and care in which he's investing in them. When people serve and sacrifice for us, it should create a greater love and care for them. And moreover, the best way for them to rejoice and be glad is ultimately for them to rejoice and be glad with them at the day of Christ. That the best way they can honor this sacrifice is to have a love for each other and an appreciation for each other and a rejoicing before God with them, but that ultimately they would hold fast to the word of life so that they can participate in what this purpose is, and that's knowing Christ and knowing him at the final day. Thanks so much for joining us today here at Begin in the Word. It's our prayer that Jesus has begun today in the Word of God, you'll live out today in the Word of God.